everyone. We are thrilled to have you with us for this conversation with Ada Palmer on the nature of intellectual transformation. And as we get started, I'm Seth Green. I am, on an afternoon like this one, especially proud to say that I'm the Dean of the Graham School here at the University of Chicago, where we have the joy of having incredible faculty like Ada Palmer teaching in our courses on lifelong learning. Let me welcome you virtually to the University of Chicago. And as you can see, it's always a beautiful day here at the university. This is a place where big ideas are born that change and challenge the world. And the Graham School is the place where for 130 years, we have been pioneering lifelong learning and making sure that those big ideas that are at our university and others around the world are brought to all learners of all ages and all stages and all vocations. And just a little bit about what makes us unique is that we are committed to exploring the big ideas that change and challenge the world through the lifelong liberal arts. And we refuse to shy away from the hard questions. And so in a time when there is increasingly an echo chamber, we are deeply committed to inviting deep inquiry and having open exchange in the spirit of learning from one another. And all of our classrooms are set up with that goal in mind. We have 4 types of programs, and today we're going to be speaking with one of the incredible faculty members in our open enrollment courses. But I just want to let you know that other opportunities at the school include our Master of Liberal Arts, our basic program of liberal education for adults, and annual programs that go deep into everything from civics to museum publishing. And then I'll just share that we have a number of opportunities coming up for you to dive deeper into the Graham School. Later this week, we'll have voices from our writer studio. And then over the next week that follows, we'll have a sample discussion in our basic program, To Be or Not to Be. We'll have a discussion with the course on First Fascist Century, which is taught by David Gutierrez. We'll have a conversation on the future of work with Elisha Abate. And we will have the First Friday lecture with Virtue as Frenzy by Kendall Sharp. I'll put in the chat momentarily the link where you can sign up for any or all of those. But today you are here for a very special reason, which is we are going to hear a preview of the course coming up from Ada Palmer, who is Associate Professor of Early Modern European History and the College at the University of Chicago. And if I were to give you her full bio, we could be here for the 45 minutes of our conversation. So I'll just point out a few of the many reasons we are so excited to have her on our team, at least temporarily, here at Graham this autumn. She is a best-selling book author of sci-fi as well as high scholarship work in history. She is an award-winning teacher and mentor, and she recently received the Quantrell Award, which is believed to be the nation's oldest prize for undergraduate teaching. And one of the reasons that she received that is because her classes are both brilliant and a lot of fun. And I just wanted to share this photo from a class that she teaches on the Italian Renaissance, where she includes a live action role-playing game of the papal election of 1490. And in the game, the students actually get a packet on their historical figure, which includes each figure's background, political allies, marriage alliances, and more, making me quite jealous that I was not one of her students when I was an undergrad. And so she is someone who blends brilliant scholarship with incredible teaching and is an example of what we believe in for education at the University of Chicago. And so, Professor Palmer, we are very excited to have a conversation with you today. I'm going to ask a few questions to get us started, and then we're going to turn over to the chat. So for the 238 of you who are already here, please think about what you'd like to ask Professor Palmer. And to set the table for my first question, I'll just say that your class that you're going to be teaching this fall in our open enrollment is on the monks to Voltaire, which means 1200 to 1750 in Europe. And in it, you look at 4 interlinked revolutions: medieval scholasticism, the Renaissance revival of antiquity, the new philosophy of the 17th century, and the Enlightenment. And so to set the table, both for me, as I'm still learning about this period, and for now our 240 guests, can you give a snapshot? And I know this is a dangerous thing to ask a historian who's written prize-winning books, but like the 5-minute snapshot of these 4 interlinked revolutions to set the table for the rest of our discussion.
Sure. So one of the things this course tries to do is stitch together things that are usually taught and looked at separately. Because each of these 4 major changes in the history of European thought and European pursuit of knowledge and truth involves making claims that they're throwing away the earlier stuff and doing something different and better. Each of them claims to be a new beginning. And words like Renaissance are exactly that, about claiming a break, claiming discontinuity, claiming that the thing that you're doing is not just innovative, but breaking with an earlier method. And it's very easy when you study this material, when you teach this material, to be drawn into those claims of there is a break and we begin from scratch and think, okay, well, that's a good place to begin my course. I'll begin there when we begin from scratch. But the interesting question becomes, what leads to the moment when people think they need to make a break and begin from scratch? What is the setup for one of these moments? And to look also at how much continuity there is and how very much all of these are not, we stopped doing A and we started doing B, but we were doing A and then we added B and then we added C and then we added D. And if you think about technologies, I sometimes think of these as intellectual technologies. If you think about technologies, it's parallel because, with the advent of email, we didn't completely stop using fax machines and pneumatic tubes. They're still used for some particular functions, right? Every bank has pneumatic tubes for sending cash around. It's not what we use for mail. We're using other things. And other technological revolutions are similar, right? We think about the printing press as a major revolution in information technology, but we still produce manuscripts. We produce manuscripts now. Think of how big the blank book section of any bookstore is when you go in to shop. Every one of those is intended to become a manuscript. And sometimes the old thing is actually not only parallel, but thriving in the space of the new one. Twitter and social media exist, but we sure still write a lot of email. And similarly, when we look at something like the formal and semi-scholastic educational system that comes out of the late Middle Ages and is led by the Jesuits, there are more schools teaching that 2 intellectual revolutions later than there were at the moment that we think of as its height. But the moment we think of it as height isn't the moment at which it's most widespread. It's the moment at which it's the newest thing, which often means it's the least widespread and actually has its largest impact centuries later. So the 4 in a row are this late medieval scholastic moment. This is Thomas Aquinas and Peter Abelard, a moment when new methods of using formal logic were believed at the time to have created a revolution in the reliability of arriving at truth, especially about theology. If you think about theology in the Middle Ages, it's high stakes because if you're wrong about your theological conclusion, in the point of view of the time period, both you and everyone who reads your book is going to go to hell forever. So it's much better to not voice an opinion on a thing than to voice an opinion and be wrong. So there's a great feeling of, being an intellectual in that period is being on a tightrope above a lava pit in terms of how high risk it is. And so you really want that safety net. That safety net is the scholastic method based on Aristotle's logic, which is developed in the 1200s and very late 1100s and is the first of these revolutions and is focused at reliably arriving at truth. The second revolution then is the revival of the classics in the Renaissance, which epicenters in Italy, but rapidly has centers in Spain and Hungary and then in France and England and other places, and involved an effort to reread and re-examine the classics, not because nobody had been reading them, they had been reading them, but to use them differently and to use them in a way which was much more political and in a particular sense utilitarian. They were looking for methods from antiquity that would not only improve technology and art, which it did, but would also improve statecraft and stability. And we're trying to use the classics not as their scholastic predecessors did to arrive at truth, but to arrive at peace. And actively applied political stability within Europe. There's a reason this is the period that eventually births Machiavelli, who we point to as the father of political science. The third break then comes circa 1600 with what is sometimes called the scientific revolution, when a number of figures looking at both of these earlier systems and educated within them and reading their works conclude that they contradict each other a lot, and specifically that the many classical texts, which Renaissance people have searched out and gathered together, also contradict each other a lot. You can't just say, well, Aristotle is smart, therefore we'll go with Aristotle, and Plato is smart, therefore we'll go with Plato, when Plato and Aristotle directly disagree about things. And so that moment has inherited from the two earlier systems a whole lot of competing truth claims. People who are really confident that they are correct about a thing, which contradicts the other thing. And so the conclusion is we need to develop a new method. We can't base this on raw logic quite as much. We can't base it just on authority. What do? We use empiricism. And so this is the birth of experimental science, the moment of what we would call the scientific method coming into being, and a moment when comparing older texts and logic with observation and new data gathered from measuring, from testing, et cetera, becomes a new way of trying to sort between rival truth claims to arrive at truth. This finally then arrives at the Enlightenment, which is the moment when what in the 17th century had been mainly applied to trying to understand fundamentals like physics and what we will call chemistry, start trying to apply it much more to statecraft. In that way, it parallels Renaissance revival of the classics and is once again can we use this to make our laws better? Can we use this to make our governments more fair? Can we use this to make our religion more sensible and comb out the superstitious doctrine and get at something more pure, a thing that has been attempted over and over in many different centuries. But this leads to the widespread application of empirical methods to law, religion, state, and education, leading eventually to the calls for universal education that lead to the American and French revolutions and the new systems that are tried after that with the American experiment. So the idea is to look at these four revolutions, which are often studied in isolation, and see how each one of them is in fact continuing and contributing to the next one. That this is teamwork, not rejection and replacement.
Well, so you are an intellectual historian, which means that you study the way that ideas change over time. And so I'm curious to just kind of take a step back for a second and ask the question of, what does the transformation that you just described tell us more broadly about how ideas evolve over time?
I mean, a big thing that it tells us is that ideas accumulate rather than replacing, that ideas rise and fall in popularity. So sometimes you'll have an idea that is 800 years old that suddenly fits the needs and questions of the moment at which people are looking at it. But above all, that the useful approach is less to look for ideas than to look for questions. What are the big questions that are the issue for a particular century? We can look at the 20th century, which is more recent and familiar to a lot of us, right? World War II and the atrocities that were perpetrated during it, the aftermath of World War I, this led one of the big questions of humanity in the 20th century to be, why did we do this? What does it mean that we are capable of this? What does this tell us about human nature? What can we do to prevent this from happening again? Are we too powerful? Should we be afraid of our own power? Now, those are new questions of that century that are very important questions. And all different sorts of philosophers, ideas, novels, even television programs are contributors to the conversation around those questions. So if you learn what are the big questions of a particular century, you can then read any text from that century and understand why it's looking at what it's looking at. I think anybody who has read pre-modern books ever has had the experience of, sort of skimming through some bits of it that don't make any sense and then getting to other bits that are clear and do make sense, and then skimming through other bits. Even if you go to a Shakespeare play and watch Hamlet or Romeo and Juliet, you'll sort of be following the romance segments, but a little vaguer on some of the political relations between families and what the dynamic with the Prince of Verona is, for example. But when you learn what the hot questions of the day are, then you can approach any text and know how to begin looking at it. So my goal is not to leave you with an encyclopedic knowledge of the centuries I'm looking at it. My goal is to leave you with the open door of, I know what the questions here are. Many of you, especially if you've done the basic program, have read Hobbes's Leviathan. And you may remember that the beginning of Hobbes's Leviathan, you're sort of waiting for him to get around to the politics and the nasty, Brutish, and short part that we've all heard of. And there's this opening section on how to prove that you're not actually dreaming and whether it's possible to know the difference between being awake and being asleep. And you're sitting here saying, what does this have to do with the origin of politics? I thought this was a political science question. And the answer is Descartes had raised this as a big question. And it was part of the skeptical crisis of the very late 16th century. Montaigne is another author contributing to this. And one of the big worries of Hobbes' century was, how do we know that our sense data is right? How do we know that what we see is real? How do we know that there isn't, as Descartes posited, or as the Matrix movie also posited, some incredibly powerful force creating an illusion to deceive us into believing that the world around us is real when some other world is actually real? That's why that chapter is at the beginning of Leviathan. And it doesn't make sense until you know the questions of Hobbes' century. But when you've learned the question, it opens the door to understanding any text from that era.
Well, so I want to continue with kind of giving a sense of how this class influences not just our understanding of European history, but even our own history today. And one element which you just spoke to is how the theme of that evolution, gives us ideas of how ideas evolve generally. Let me dig in as well to how this period from 1200 to 1750 really sets up for the world that we now inherit. And I'm curious if you can just speak to, your class is going to end at 1750, but how does what's happening over these four interlinked revolutions relate to our understanding of the world today, particularly in the US?
So two different answers to that. One of them, the immediate aftermath, and the other, our contemporary lives. The accumulation of these four intellectual revolutions, all four of them together, that's the education of the drafters of the US Constitution, of the founders of the new French Republic, of the people who were in charge in the birth of this era of experimenting with democracy. They were raised on a combination of scholastic education, humanists' text, and humanist edited classics, plus scientific works of the previous century, and then lived in the Enlightenment. So, there's a moment at the sort of 2/3 mark of this course where I just read out, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and etc. And suddenly that language is familiar. Suddenly we understand, oh, wait, self-evident, that's a very specific term. It doesn't mean obvious or true. It's in there because it's actually a technical reference to Descartes, and the people of the era would have recognized that and known it, and how much the conversations of the era are behind the theory that a populace can govern a nation, which was a radical new idea that most people in earlier eras of history would have never believed was possible, that most people would not be capable of being educated enough to be a voter and participate in this. So we're looking at the roots of that revolution and how people got to the mindset that they were willing to take that experimental leap. The other, then, jumping to our contemporary, when we wake up in the morning and check whatever news sources we usually have to see what the latest political situation is, or international news. News and politics are full of claims about history, claims about power, claims about legitimacy, especially which regimes are legitimate and which regimes are illegitimate. And a lot of those invoke history. A lot of them claim we are the continuity with the continuation of X good thing, or we are similar to X good thing. We're going to have a Renaissance or a golden age if you elect me to the thing. Or, the Constitution, when it was drafted, intended X. all of these different claims about history are efforts to use history as a tool to legitimize things, to make things seem valid and important. To use the simplest and baldest example of this, whenever you go by a bank and it has columns and a pediment on the front, it's invoking ancient Rome because of the mystique of stability and long-lastingness and tradition and something that's still going to be there in 1,000 years, which is something that we want in a bank. We're surrounded by claims about history which are used to prop up and legitimate anything from a corporation to a political campaign to a nation. And when we understand more about the complexities of the histories that are being invoked, the fact that, the Renaissance seems like a golden age to us when we see its relics in museums, mostly because of a propaganda campaign to try to make it into a golden age, which was partly launched during the Renaissance and partly during this 19th century. We realize how very much claims about things like golden ages, dark ages, revivals, regimes, etc., are artificial and constructed and are invoking particular readings of history. I know a lot of people who want to, say there is no Renaissance and there is no Middle Age. It's just a continuous up and up and up and up steadily. I have a very good friend, David M. Perry, who just published a book called The Bright Ages, which is a great history of the Middle Ages. And we have to understand why we think these things are good or bad, why different moments and different regimes are claimed to be an upswing or a fall or a dark age or a revival or purer or less pure or decadent or corrupt compared to each other. And it's Europe that is invoked most often. China gets invoked a bit, but different eras in Europe get invoked the most, especially all over the world, right? There are Capitol buildings invoking ancient Rome, really invoking Renaissance imitations of ancient Rome, being built in Africa and Asia because this European culture of power, this European language for making claims about which bits of history are important and legitimate, were exported via Europe's empires and became a language of power that is legible around the globe in a way no other culture's historical language of power is. So when we learn the origins of the elements of this language of power, which is partly architectural, partly rhetorical, partly the canon of great figures on pedestals, when we learn about its origin, we can then semi-immunize ourselves against it, know when it's being used on us, use it ourselves to deploy things. And that is relevant to questions of every corner of the globe, because Europe's histories of power get invoked when we talk about Afghanistan, when we talk about which regimes in Africa are or aren't advanced. All of these claims are shaped by European claims about power. So in that sense, studying Europe's claims about its own history is key to decolonialism and all of these other things, because we need to know what the language of power is in order to dismantle it. Notice when it's being used, notice moments when it's being inverted and appropriated and used by indigenous people. I have a great friend, Stuart McManus, who's a fellow of the university, who works on Latin orations in the style of Cicero, which were composed by indigenous Aztec nobility under the Spanish colonial regime in the 1500s and 1600s, discussing the great, wonderful antiquity of their ancient Aztec ancestors using the language that Renaissance people used to talk about Rome, in order to exert their own power and dignity and argue for rights and privileges that they want to have under Spanish rule. So this language of power is used all over the place. It's used by colonizers. It's then inverted and used by colonized. And all of these are tools that are opened up to us when we understand the claims about Europe's development and the claims it uses to justify the idea that its culture is cultured and other cultures must match a bar that matches it to be called cultured.
Well, I don't know if you're reading the chat, but you are answering the questions that are coming in brilliantly. And so maybe I'll combine two here and just allow you to elaborate any more on these, because I think you've just been speaking to both of them, but I want to get them in to the discussion directly. Alan has a question. Dr. Palmer, how can we draw useful lessons from history that will help us make better decisions in the present? And then Eunjung Lee has a question that in my mind is almost a specific manifestation of that idea of how history can inform our present. She is curious how the theme of encountering the other might be explained. In example that she gives, how did encounters with non-European people during this time period shape the foundations for white supremacy, which you were just getting into with decolonialism. But let me just give you two questions that you've already been speaking to, but see if you want to elaborate any more on either of those, and then I'll get to some of the other questions in the chat.
Yeah, and I'm looking up the name of a book that I'm about to recommend by an awesome prof at Northwestern, but I can never remember his name, even though he's a friend, because I'm terrible with names. So there's a wonderful book by Robert Launay called Savages, Romans, and Despots, Thinking About Others from Montaigne to Herder. So meaning from the late 1500s forward. And it's an amazing book. He's an anthropologist, and it's actually sort of a history of the discipline of anthropology. But what it does is help us look at the fact that Europe's ideas about its own supremacy, we are used to thinking of going very far back, but they don't go very far back. They develop in the imperial period. They develop primarily in the late 1500s and then especially 1600s and 1700s. When you look at Europe's writings about other eras, other regions of the world earlier than that, Renaissance Europe, when I'm mostly focusing on the 1400s, is very aware that it is culturally primitive compared to its neighbors to the east, that the advanced science and the great wealth is farther east in the Ottoman world and in the places that the Silk Road brings goods from. Similarly, if you go back a little earlier, Vikings, I love the Viking map of the world, or Snorri's specifically, there are several. Their theory is the further north you go, it gets colder and colder until the world is just ice. The further south you go, it gets hotter and hotter until the world is just fire. And the further east you go, it gets richer and richer until the world is made of gold. And that's the Viking understanding, because they're very aware of themselves as the poorest and Europe as the second poorest, and that the farther east you go, the more wealthy and powerful civilizations become. Launay's book is a history of how we get from that to Europe trying to justify itself in as supreme. And indeed, the claims that were made in the Renaissance about, because we have read the classics, we can do things better, is one of the tools that gets magnified into that. It also gets magnified into other things and is core to the beginning of democracy in a counterintuitive way, which I'll go into in a moment. But it absolutely is the beginning of if you haven't read Cicero and Horace, you're not cultured. Therefore, Europe can claim that its culture is superior to all of these other ones. Therefore, it can justify the destruction of other civilizations that it comes to. Although even then, it's radically inconsistent in its treatment of the local cultures of different places. Not even country by country or empire by empire, but just place by place, because there was no way to enforce policy consistently across different eras, which is how within the Portuguese-controlled empire and the Spanish empire, you could have situations like in colonial, what is now Mexico and what was then New Spain, where enormous efforts were poured into making dictionaries of indigenous languages and efforts to translate texts back and forth, but especially into indigenous languages in order to facilitate communication. While at the exact same time in Goa on the west of India, which was another European-controlled colony, the policy was to destroy all texts in the indigenous language and try to destroy the indigenous language and use only the colonial language. These policies being used at the same time because they have utterly opposite attitudes toward what are we trying to do? Are we trying to replace this culture? Are we trying to integrate the good parts and put in others? All of which are destructive in very different ways. So touching then on the second question of what it shows us about how we can use history, one way we can use history is learning what the arguments and ideas were behind past practices, which both helps us understand how to deal with and dismantle the bad after effects of past practices, but also helps us look out for those impulses in present day culture and say, well, the one laptop per child program is really cool, giving all sorts of people in a impoverished area their kids access to the internet, but we need to make sure that it isn't repeating any of these patterns of feeling that particular cultures are superior to others or particular languages are going to erase others. So we need to pair that with the kinds of materials that will prevent a repeat of the earlier mistakes. A lot of historians I know use the line, history does not repeat, but it does rhyme. That circumstances, and this is Machiavelli's attitude as well, don't repeat exactly, but similar patterns and structures do. And so we can use history as a case book of examples and look for the examples that are most similar to what's going on in our own situation. I'm involved in a collaborative project with a number of other specialists in the history of information technology, as well as some present day information technology and anti-censorship activists, to look at what the print revolution and the censorship movements that tried to regulate print can tell us about the censorship of social media and the internet and the impulses that are driving it right now. Because whenever you have a new information technology, you then have organizations and people in power attempting to censor it. And you also have people who are, grassroots uncomfortable with things they're seeing in that medium and call on a grassroots level, bottom up, not top down, for the censorship of whatever this thing is that is being perceived as scary, whether it's white supremacy and hate speech, or whether it's, pornography, or whether it's, as in the case of the print revolution, the wrong version of Christianity, Catholicism in Protestant regions, Protestantism in Catholic regions, was one of the big stimulators of developing censorship of print. And if we look at how one revolution caused these types of censorship to be developed, which then had these impacts, we can then use that to try to say, okay, as regimes and corporations are trying to set up censorship now, can we get them to imitate the ones that were less destructive to culture and not the ones that were more destructive to culture in the earlier instances of the same thing? So history can be a tool for understanding other people's claims about history, or it can be a set of case books of, let's find a situation similar to the one we're in. And both of these are very valuable uses of history.
Well, so speaking of how we can use history to better understand and better interpret, we have a question here from David Yamada. Dr. Palmer, you're referencing our use of history to interpret current events. Given your broad grasp of historical arcs, could you share your thoughts on whether the seeming revival of illiberal thinking and practice, such as anti-science and anti-intellectual, is a temporary blip or indicative of a deeper and longer trend? And I know you may not be ready for the either or, but how do you, from looking back at history, interpret this moment and how we can use history as a guide to, why we might be here, what it may mean?
Yeah. So anti-intellectual bursts are very common and then do tend to get dismantled in various ways. But I think we have to zoom out and remember the larger thing that is happening is that we're in the middle of a very quickly moving information revolution. And quickly moving information revolutions always have what my colleague Kathleen Ballou, who actually works on the history of white supremacy, calls very aptly the early adopter effect. There is a cost to moving to a new technology. You have to learn it. You have to develop an audience that knows how to use it. You have to often spend money on it. So whether it's buying the first printing press and setting it up in your city, whether it's learning how to use Tinder instead of whatever other apps you've been using, whether it's, there's a cost to that, a cost in effort on your own part, right? Or in between, whether it's buying a radio or making a local radio station, or whether it's getting a ditto machine to set up in your home so that you can print things. It takes effort. That means that it's always done first by the people who weren't being served under the earlier information technology. The people who couldn't communicate effectively before are the ones who are most eager to plunge most quickly into the new tech. That means that in addition to random groups who aren't being served for various reasons, it'll always include the groups that were being actively silenced under the earlier regime. Because jumping into the new one that doesn't have methods of silencing yet, they can suddenly be loud. So when we look at early adopters, The ditto machine is a wonderful and easy example of this. So this is a 20th century invention that allows you to make inexpensive copies at home. Many of us may remember having the blue ink, dittos and mimeographs as our homework when we were at school, when we were young. This allowed the inexpensive production of newsletters and the inexpensive production of sort of small scale print runs of things, which meant it was quickly adopted by lots of linguistic minorities who could finally have a local newsletter in their language. It was quickly adopted by lots of new social groups like Trekkies and the beginning of science fiction fandom being able to make newsletters and circulating with each other. It was adopted by civil rights activists, LGBT groups, both activist groups and just social groups looking for a date, who couldn't express themselves in a normal newspaper, which was censoring such material, but who could express themselves in a ditto printed newsletter. And it was adopted very wholeheartedly by the KKK, which used it to print and circulate its materials without having to go to a post office to use a public printing machine where you could be subject to public censure and often rejection. So as a result, suddenly all the voices that are scary get louder. Other voices get louder too. Science fiction fans, tropical fish hobbyists. That was another one in this moment. But the linguistic minorities and the gay groups and the civil rights activists and the white supremacists all got louder at once. And that makes people feel fear and anxiety and tension. And it leads to exactly what we are experiencing now, in which every time a new social media thing is set up, it is immediately moved into by whatever groups were successfully being silenced on the earlier one. It then scrambles to come up with ways to silence that material, and they move to the next one. So we are living in a moment in which not only white supremacy, not only anti-intellectualism, but a whole lot of uncomfortable voices, uncomfortable on both ends of a political spectrum, are being magnified a whole lot. And one of the things that feeds anti-intellectualism is when you're suddenly hearing the intellectuals and their ideas more. And that's happening as well. And so it's not only that the anti-intellectuals can express themselves better, but they're seeing expression by people they associate with the intellectual world more as well. So all of these scary voices get louder. And we need to understand that, and that's going to keep happening as new apps are developed, because every time a new one is developed, it doesn't yet have methods for silencing this, and it'll move on. So we are in an era in which year by year, the scary voices on all periphery of a spectrum are going to get louder, and they're going to keep getting louder, and they're going to keep getting louder. And we need to develop new tools for thinking about news, about reliability of fact, to try to sort through these things and figure out how to get to reliable information. The one silver lining I can propose on this is it's happened before and we've been okay. Shakespeare is full of references to how anxious he and his audience are about fake news. Henry IV, Part 2 begins with rumor personified, gloating about how easy it is to circulate fake news and fake reports of what happened in a battle. Winter's Tale has a whole segment of a ballad monger selling fake newsletters to ignorant farmers, and the ignorant farmers even say, and we know it's true because it's in print. So Shakespeare knows that his audience is really worried about not only false information, but about less educated people in his culture, mostly rural people, being fooled by that material. We've lived with these crises repeatedly. Every time that's happened, we have adapted and developed things like the aggregate newspapers that analyze material. We're in the stage when we haven't yet succeeded, but everyone is aware that changing around how we deal with news and press is urgent. And so we're going to keep trying new things. This is a small consolation when you're in the middle of the crisis, and the crisis is terrifying, and we are seeing its negative political impacts and its harm that it's doing to educational institutions. But I'm confident from the last 8 times humanity has dealt with an information revolution that we will deal with this one. But also that, like the last 8 times humanity dealt with an information revolution, it will be tumultuous. And we are living with those tumults, and those tumults are going to continue and be, if anything, more extreme, not less.
Well, so, we have 4 minutes and we have a number of questions about the course. And so would love for you to just give a snapshot, not just of the content of the course, which you did in the opening question, but also the format of your course, because I know you're looking for a
Yes,
very interactive experience. And
yeah.
then there are some specific questions from what appear to be very good students from my sense in the chat. They want to know, even though this is not graded and they won't have tests, how much reading they should plan for each week in terms of number of hours. And then for those who have asked when it is, I can tell you that it's Saturday from 10 to 12:30 online. So the rest of that, though, I'm going to turn over to you to answer, Dr. Palmer.
So I'm using a format that I developed recently that I've been very happy with, where I've made transcripts of my lectures as text so that you can read the lecture, and then the entire class can be Q&A like this, where there'll be a large group of people with a lot of questions, but it can be the fully interactive, me responding to your readings of both the primary source and the lecture. So each week, the reading will be my lecture transcript and then the reading, or sometimes a shorter lecture transcript, then the reading, and then another lecture transcript that I want you to read afterward. And each week, I'll send notes saying, this one before, this one after, or the whole thing before, etc. It's very hard to estimate the number of hours for reading because people read at very different paces. But it's going to be a couple hundred pages of reading in a week. Again, the size of number of words on a page is also hard. I try hard to avoid going above 250 pages. I'm often going to be in the little bit over 100 pages range, but it depends on the size and length of the text we're looking at in any given week. And occasionally there will be some where either this text is really hard, we're only reading 6 pages of it, it's okay. Or there will be others where this is a long book and you really have to follow the whole argument, so it'll be more. I'll try to be very clear each time about which ones have more or less. And it'll always be the case that you're welcome at the discussion Q&A and so on, even if you haven't read it yet or are in the middle of it. Many of the questions will still enrich the reading and be designed to be understood. So that's the structure. And the transcript format of the lectures does mean that they are, because they're lectures and they were taken down verbatim, they are perhaps slightly less polished than if you were reading a book, but they're at the same time give us the opportunity for the classroom time to be exclusively you guys asking questions and me responding to those questions and also responding to the latest material. Additionally, one of my plans is that I'm currently in the final stages of finishing up a book about the Renaissance and about the myth of a golden age and bad Middle Ages. Some chunks of which are sort of versions of what we're looking at in this course in different ways. So as a fully optional, non-required element of the course, I'm going to share with you the manuscript of that unfinished book so that you can see, oh, interesting, here is the process of material we discussed in a course being transformed into what will be published as a book where it's condensed and polished in different ways. And we can have some conversation about the process of turning historical knowledge into a book, turning a course into a book, and the processes of that and what goes in and what doesn't, and the sort of editorial process, because I'm very interested in how books are made now, how books are made in different periods. But that is a fully optional element of it, just for those of you who would enjoy watching a book be born over the course of the quarter.
Well, Dr. Palmer, this has been a wonderful discussion. We are at time, but I'm going to ask, is there maybe the 60-second version, so power round, is there one fun story or surprise in your class that you think is one of those aha stories that you can share in short form just to end our conversation today?
Oh, well, the best one is definitely that cantaloupe caused the French Revolution. Because when cantaloupe and other New World plants are discovered, and this relates to one of the questions about the effect of the New World on this, the short answer to which is it's indispensable in triggering the scientific revolution, if there is one, or the scientific method. Cantaloupe contradicts very directly everything that Aristotle and his apprentice Theophrastus said about fruits, and that the noblest fruits, which are round and golden and similar to the sun, grow on the tops of trees, and only base, bad, lower class fruits grow on vines that lie abjectly on their bellies on the ground like a defeated prisoner of war. And so when they find this round, golden, sun-like thing that grows on limp vines on the ground, it's one very important crunch in overthrowing Theophrastus and Aristotle and getting people to say, oh, wow, actually, they're totally wrong about plants and also food. How this turns into the French Revolution is that food had been one of the proofs of nobility being a thing. Because in pre-revolutionary France, if you are a servant and your master and you trade lunch, you both get sick. We understand that this is because your stomach only produces the enzymes necessary to dissolve the things that you're used to eating. And so just as a vegetarian who suddenly has a pork chop will be sick because their body isn't used to producing the material for it. And a lot of people get sick the first time they eat foreign cuisines that contain large amounts of a particular type of protein or chemical that their bodies aren't used to. So similarly, it was true that if a peasant and his master traded lunches, they would both get sick. And so they had this idea of noble people eat noble fruits, like oranges and apples and things that grow on the tops of trees. And lower class people are meant to eat onions and garlic and things that grow in the ground. So when the hierarchy of plants is overthrown, the hierarchy of food is overthrown, which throws doubt on the question, is there a biological difference between the servant and the master, or is it just arbitrary? If we were that wrong about food, are we also that wrong about class? So indeed, Cantaloupe obviously doesn't do it alone, but is one example of how some of these oddball things, especially the unexpected discoveries of that period, whether it's the New World or the existence of vacuum, are key to people saying, wait, if that's wrong, maybe the legal system is also wrong. And it's in this spirit of inquiry and doubt and wait a minute, if lots of things are being thrown out, should we also throw out some of the forms of inequality and their justifications that turns so many small things like Cantaloupe into chinks in the armor of the most important to me and implausible of all revolutions, which is the idea that all people have equally the capacity to think, govern, and rule. And they had so much writing, so much counter evidence, so much confidence that this could not be true. To me, people say, can we battle climate change? And I look at it, it's like, yeah, climate change is a big problem. Getting people to realize that there isn't an inherent hierarchy in the world, that one is a miracle. And the small pieces that let us do it will materialize over the course of this course.
Well, that was an appetizing answer, pardon the pun, and I will never look at Cantaloupe the same way. And I'll just read a couple of the chat here in closing. It is so refreshing to have such a truth teller discuss the origins of white supremacy in this historical context. Thank you. You're a brilliant woman. Brava. Wonderful discussion. Great discussion. Brava. Yes, wonderful. Thank you. You are truly enriching all of our lives through this conversation. Thank you. And I know I look forward, and I know many others here from the chat look forward to learning more from you this autumn. Thank you all for joining us for our first in our Conversation at Graham series. And thank you, Dr. Palmer, for being a trailblazer and role model in providing your thoughts in this series.
Well, I'm excited, very excited. Can't wait. Bye, everyone. Great to meet some of you. I will see you soon.